Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Well, normally he's on the phone, but we're glad to have Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor, in the studio with us this morning. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we want to talk about the Green New Deal versus the old FDR New Deal in the 1930s.
Well, the Green New Deal is, we'll see how green it is, but it's certainly going to get a lot of attention in the next few months, and that's in part because some of the Democratic candidates who are running for president are going to put it front and center in their campaigns. The FDR New Deal is, it's historical, and unfortunately many of our population today would have no real sense as to what it involved. They may have some, kind of stereotype notion that, the government grew, which it certainly did, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty of FDR's program, we're kind of ignorant of that. And I might add, by the way, that, historians generally, there's something of a consensus, not 100%, but probably 95%, that, FDR was was probably the greatest American president during the entire 20th century. And a good deal of that commendation that he gets from historians has to do, of course, with the implementation of the New Deal.
I had Brian Gillespie over at Alfred State College for public speaking. I don't know if you knew him or not, the late Brian Gillespie. He used to say in his public speaking class at Alfred State that FDR was the best speaker of the 20th century.
Well, I don't know whether he was the best speaker of the 20th century. There have been some pretty good orators. I guess he means among presidents. But he did have a way with words. He was very, very persuasive. He was so persuasive that many Republicans, FDR, of course, was a Democrat, many Republican members of Congress would not accept invitations to the White House because they knew that they would wind up agreeing with FDR, that he was that much, he could persuade them into almost anything. So they would wind up voting for measures that they really didn't want to vote for.
Must have been an excellent politician. Must have had
Well, he was
skills.
A great politician, and he had great, as a student, he wasn't great. He was a kind of a C student, had gone to Harvard, had gone to law school, but before he became president in 1932, there were very, very prominent people who were saying something along the lines of, look, he's a very, very nice man, but he doesn't have any particular qualifications to become president. And yet today, we would, and when I say we, I mean historians generally, would argue that Lincoln and Washington and FDR remain the top of the heap. They were the three great presidents. And one of the things that FDR does during the election of, or really the campaign of 1932, is that he proposes what he calls that New Deal. Would he have been considered a great president had there not been a Great Depression during the 1930s? I don't know. Would he have been considered a great president had we not entered World War II? Because obviously he was not only a wartime president, but a very successful wartime president. Once again, I don't know. But, between the Depression and the war, FDR easily outclassed any other American politician of that period.
The Depression and Prohibition, those two kind of go together. And all that kind of was happening at the same time. You had the talking movies come in, and Prohibition came in and out. And then you had the Depression hit. Now, FDR is not the one that ended Prohibition, is he?
He is the one who ended
is he?
Prohibition.
Okay.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, would he have won the election in 1932 had he not come out for the end of Prohibition? The answer is probably. But if you go back to 1932, he says more during the campaign about Prohibition than he does about the Depression, than he does about the New Deal. And that's in part because the New Deal had not yet really been worked out. It had not yet been defined. But by 1933, when FDR became president, he offers a number of proposals. We're going to call this the first New Deal, the 100 days, and literally it was within 100 days. And he just utterly redefines the way in which Americans are going to think about their government. He says during his inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is not, the depression, is not the economic problem. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And what he was essentially saying to the American public is that, look, let's not be afraid of bold measures. And he took those bold measures. And I might add, and I think this is kind of important because it has a present-day connection. When President Trump says, for instance, that the Democrats are becoming a socialist party, well, that's what they said about FDR back in 1933. The conservatives, Republicans generally, but conservatives, argue that, he was a socialist. In fact, some of them argue that he was a communist. The fact of the matter is that FDR, through his New Deal, was not only not a socialist, he was certainly not a communist. FDR saved American capitalism. I want to say that again. FDR's New Deal saved American capitalism. So all of this fear-mongering, all the scaremongering that the Republicans back in that period were laying on FDR as, this, frightening socialist, turned out to be poppycock. He was anything but a socialist.
Now, President Roosevelt would have used radio and connected very well with the listeners of that period with his fireside chats, which are historic. Congresswoman Alexandria OcasioCortez, you almost forget her name. Everyone just calls her the AOC, and you almost forget her name. I'm guessing she uses TV and internet, though I don't think they compare her use of it with Roosevelt's use of radio.
Well, FDR was using a new technology. Needless to say, TV had not yet been invented. The internet had not been invented. Facebook, we wouldn't have known what you're talking about. But what he did by and we call this his fireside chats. It was I think, a brilliant use of this new medium, of this new radio. In a sense, he was able to connect with individual Americans and with individual American families. And he did so, and I'm thinking as I'm saying this that here we are speaking to our audience by radio, but he was able, in a sense, to become a member of the family. He was able to speak to you in relatively small groups. Compare, for instance, what FDR was doing in 1933 and 34 and 35 with what Hitler was doing. Hitler and Roosevelt became heads of their countries at roughly the very, very same time, within 5 weeks of each other. When Hitler would converse with the German people, he would do so in huge rallies, sometimes rallies that would contain 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people. And he shouted at them. Again and again, he shouts and he shouts and he shouts. FDR was very quiet. He was very soft-spoken. He was not a demagogue in the way that Hitler was a demagogue. And I think that it served him, FDR very, very well. But I go back to the point I was making about socialism. We have to keep our shirts on. We got to keep our heads about this whole thing. FDR's program for Social Security, which is hugely popular today, was called socialist. His program to put people to work, for the government to put them to work in forests and in WPA projects, Works Progress Administration projects, such as building Jones Beach, such as building national parks and whatnot. All this was called socialism. Well, what it did is it put people back to work, and then they had money, because they were getting salaries that they can use to buy goods, whether those goods were made by General Motors or made by Ford Motor Company or made by RCA. It was a program, as I said earlier, to essentially rebuild the capitalist structure of the United States.
On Alexandria OcasioCortez and FDR, she is not a master of the media in the way that Roosevelt was with radio, but she does connect. Is it personality, is it message, or maybe both?
I think it's probably a combination of both. And some of what she says right now is, I think needs saying. She has been hammered by conservatives for misinformation, and sometimes she does. Perhaps this is just a problem of, her experience or her lack of experience.
That's what Sean Hogan said. He said someday she's going to be a powerful force. Right now she's a little naive on some things, but
But I think that she has she's kind of identified the soft spot of contemporary American capitalism. She made the point the other day that someone was saying to the effect that she wants the government to control the corporations, and her response was, well, right now the corporations control the government. Well, there's a lot of evidence that that's true. The number of lobbyists in Washington today compared to the number of lobbyists in Washington, let's say in 1980, we probably have 5 times as many lobbyists, 3,000 back in that period, 14 to 15,000 today. These are high-paid people working for, very, very well-paid people, and, who's left out of all of this? We are, the public. I was, interested just yesterday to hear that President Trump has offered a new budget, a proposed budget to Congress for the next fiscal year. And it calls for the reduction in Medicare by approximately, I believe, 5%, the reduction in Medicaid by, again, around 5 to 10% or so. This is by a president who had said during the campaign that he would never cut Medicare, and he would never cut Social Security, and he would never cut Medicaid. But he's doing exactly that. Once again, he's breaking his promises. Well, people like AOC, people like Bernie Sanders are obviously picking up on this and arguing that we shouldn't be giving tax breaks to large corporations. We should be giving, providing social programs to the people who need it most.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, having a very interesting conversation this morning, comparing FDR to AOC. Bernie Sanders is in the presidential race, and there's the Steuben County Democrats for Bernie Facebook page that's growing. And I expect it to grow by leaps and bounds for Steuben County because he did very well last time in the primary. What would Roosevelt say about the policies of Bernie Sanders? What do you think?
Well, look, Roosevelt was not a socialist, and Bernie Sanders he really is a socialist. But I think it's also important to note that he is a democratic socialist. And, we sometimes don't make the sorts of distinctions that are really important. Europe. Our European allies. By that I mean the Germans, the French, the English, the Danes, the Scandinavians, the Italians. They have socialist parties. People, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, are not particularly exercised and not particularly upset by the fact that you have socialists in power over there. In the United States, socialism has been something of a third rail. But there are different kinds of socialism. If you think of socialist, democratic socialism, Bernie Sanders kind of socialism, and compare it to, let's say, Stalin's communism, there is a world of difference. One is totalitarianism, and the other is, very, very frankly, democratic. So I think that, we have to keep our shirts on. And let me give you, again, one other kind of example of what I mean by that. One of the elements of the Green New Deal is free college tuition. Well, the opponents are saying this is socialism. We can't have this, not in the United States of America. But the fact of the matter is that we have had free education in this country for approximately 170 years, going back to the 1840s in Massachusetts. We began to provide young people in Massachusetts and then in other areas of New England and eventually across the United States with free primary education and then with free secondary education. And right now there are many, many states that provide free college education without tuition in community colleges and whatnot. What Bernie Sanders is arguing is that we ought to expand it to all areas of education. It's simply an expansion of what we already have. And while I happen not to be necessarily in favor of that on the college side, it's not as if somehow or another it's going to destroy the United States. So, here again, let's just keep things in perspective.
Talking to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Let's take a quick break, come back, and we'll continue our conversation comparing what's going on right now with Congresswoman Alexandria OcasioCortez with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's period. Stay with us.
Would you like to start saving money in a smart, simple, and convenient way? Now you can with Snap Savings from Steuben Trust Company. You can start by enrolling your Steuben Trust debit card. You can use your card for everyday purchases at stores or online. Every transaction will be rounded up to the next whole dollar and transferred into your Steuben Trust savings account. Make saving your money a snap with Steuben Trust. Stop into any location or visit SteubenTrust.com to learn more. Steuben Trust Company, member FDIC, and equal housing lender.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, last week you were saying that it looked like a storm might hit on Saturday, which was bad news because that's St. Patrick's Day. What's the latest there?
Well, it looks like the storm now, Brian, is going to come through on Friday, so being out over a week and a half, the estimate wasn't too bad. It looks like we're going to be rather blustery this weekend in the wake of that storm and much cooler. Can't rule out a passing flurry or snow shower, especially on Saturday, but it certainly doesn't look like we're going to see the storm system that'll move through on Friday, so the weather will be improving this weekend. That storm is actually in the process of developing right now out over the southwestern part of the country. It is expected to produce blizzard conditions from Denver on up into South Dakota later this week, and some very heavy rain and very strong winds from Texas all the way on up into the western Great Lakes states. Today, across the southern tier, we're looking at a lot of cloudiness this morning associated with cooler weather working its way into our region. Any flurries should be in the process of drying up. We'll turn partly sunny later today with 35 to 40. Sunrise, Brian, was at 7:26. Sunset tonight at 7:13. Clear skies are in the forecast for tonight as high pressure settles in across the northeast. This morning, that system's out by Chicago. We're going to be 15 to 20. Tomorrow, partial sun, turning milder, 50 to 55. Clouds increase tomorrow night, lows 35 to 40. Thursday, cloudy, breezy, chance of showers. Quite mild Thursday, Brian. Highs will be anywhere from 55 to 60.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. We got talking during the break about how President Roosevelt concealed the fact that he was in a wheelchair back in the 1930s from the American public. And we were saying, it would have been a lot more difficult, in fact, impossible, to prevent people from knowing. But that was his policy. He didn't want people to know.
Well, he was fearful that, and I think with good reason, that his political opponents would essentially argue not that he was, quote, handicapped, but rather that he was a cripple, and therefore that he wasn't up to the job, that he could not, in fact, be president of the United States. Whether that was true or not is, kind of hard to say. And our attitudes toward handicapped individuals today is much, much different, I think, than it was back in that period. But FDR did a very, very good job of hiding this. During the campaign of 1936, when he ran for re-election, he was wearing two braces on his legs, each, steel, weighing about 18 pounds apiece. He had to, just move around with that. And when he was literally walking upright now to the podium at the Philadelphia Convention in 1936, he stumbled. He fell. He was furious at that because he felt it would give away that, if you will, quote, secret. But the fact of the matter is that the press was different back in 1936. They could have reported that, and they did not. There was a sense in which they respected, if you will, the person, and they respected, if you will, the privacy of the individual. And so it was it simply didn't become an issue. But I do want to say something, if I may, about that 1935-1936 period. FDR's New Deal included things like Social Security, included things like banking reform. And you already heard me say before that while it extends the idea of the welfare state, it's certainly not socialism per se. There's no attempt whatsoever to nationalize private property or to eliminate private property, as someone like Karl Marx would have wanted to do, some years earlier. But there was one big gap in FDR's New Deal, and that big gap was medicine. It was medical care. It was health insurance. It simply was not proposed. It would not be until Harry Truman became president after World War II, and then finally enacted in 1964 by Lyndon Johnson, that we're going to find the government really addressing the issue of medical care. And I should add, too, that when Medicare was first proposed, it was denounced, and it was denounced for 20 years, denounced again and again and again as socialist. Today, how many Americans over the age of 65, regardless of their political complexion, would argue that we should eliminate Medicare? So, we got to understand that, some of politics is propaganda, and yet, we're a better country, I think a much stronger country, as a result of having Medicare and having Medicaid for our population.
I wanted to ask you this quickly because I have other questions that I think are that I want to get to, I should say. Farming in the New Deal. Is it the New Deal where we see for the first time farmers getting grants from the government?
You bet. Well, I shouldn't say for the first time. There was a program back during the 1920s called McNary-Haugen that very few of our listeners are going to be able to identify, that provided subsidies for farmers so that they could sell some of their goods at market prices rather than at below market prices. And the reason that was important is because while we tend to think of the 1920s as a period of prosperity, which it was generally for Americans, but it was not a period of prosperity for American farmers. There was a depression, a farm depression that begins right after World War I in 1919, and it continues right through the New Deal itself. And so the McNary-Haugen program, providing farm subsidies, was geared to address that. What FDR does is to considerably expand the programs for aid to farmers, not the least of which is to have farmers reduce production in certain areas so that fewer goods produced, and the idea was that it would drive prices up, which it did to a certain extent, but never quite as successful as they had hoped.
Down to the last 2 minutes, Dr. Ostrower, Congresswoman Omar's comments recently that got her into trouble, and Father Coughlin's radio show of the 1930s that got him into trouble with bias to 12.
Well, I think that there's not much of a comparison. Father Coughlin began as a supporter of Roosevelt. Initially, at least, he was certainly not anti-Semitic. By 1939, 1940, by the beginning of World War II, he had a radio audience, remember, of a population then that only, maybe 150 million people, 140 million people. About 10 million people a week would tune into his radio program on CBS. And he became viciously anti-Semitic. It became the most important single theme in his radio broadcast. Congresswoman Omar, who made this, some anti-Semitic comments, or at least comments that I would view as, kind of marginally anti-Semitic, simply doesn't have that kind of an audience. She doesn't have that kind of influence, and she has a public, both Democrat and Republican, that are much, much more willing to call her to account. So, is she anti-Semitic? Maybe. I think she probably is. She's certainly very anti-Israel. That I think we can say. But it's also important to note that, to criticize the Israeli government does not automatically make someone anti-Semitic.
With that, we're out of time. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.